Afternoon from London. I know we have people joining us from all around the world, so good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you are joining us today. And welcome to this webinar on supporting people with disabilities into senior roles. I'm Siobhan Bonita. I'm a former UK senior civil servant, and it's my absolute pleasure to be chairing this webinar today on behalf of Global Government Forum that helps civil servants to connect and join up and share ideas all around the world. As I said before, today we are offering closed captioning and you will have been sent a link. You can click on the link if you would like a page of captions, or you can go to the CC icon on your screens at any time, click on that and you will get access to the captions today. Now, in terms of the topic today, around the world, people with disabilities are still sadly poorly represented in leadership positions, and civil services are no exception. In general, the further you go up the hierarchy in an organisation, in the public sector, the lower the prevalence of people with disabilities becomes. Now, there are many reasons for this, from outright prejudice or ignorance to lack of leadership and coordination across public sector organisations, and to organisations not putting in place the adjustments and support that would enable people with disabilities to fulfil their potential, and many more issues as well. As a consequence, not only do leadership cadres not reflect the diversity of the wider population, but civil service bodies are losing out on talent and highly capable people. We have an absolutely fantastic panel with us here today, and we're going to be exploring all of those issues and more. I'm going to introduce that panel in a moment, but this is also to say that once we've heard from our panel members, it's an opportunity for you, our audience today, to put your questions to that panel, and we will get through as many of those questions as we can before the end of the webinar. So at any point from now on, please use the Q&A function. It will be somewhere on your screens, depending on the device you're using, to send in your questions. Don't be shy. We have such a great panel here today. It would be a shame not to pick their brains while we have them with us. So now I'm going to introduce our panel. But first, we will hear from Yasmin Laroche, who is Canada's first Deputy Minister of Public Service Accessibility and champion for federal employees with disabilities at the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. Yasmin is responsible for overseeing the efforts of the Canadian Public Service to meet the requirements of the Accessible Canada Act. A career public servant, she has served in a variety of leadership roles in many different federal departments and agencies. Then we will hear from Christina Cerral, who is Lived Experience Ambassador for NHS England and NHS Improvement. Christina joined the NHS in 2018 as London's first musculoskeletal patient director, and since early 2020 she has been the Lived Experience Ambassador, where she champions both the promotion of co-production and the active involvement of patients and their carers in all aspects of the planning, design and delivery of care. Then we'll hear from Susan Scott Parker, Obie, who is founder of Business Disability International. Susan founded the world's first business disability network and first leadership development program for persons with disabilities. And she has also launched the first benchmarking tool to measure a corporation's disability performance. Susan continues to connect leaders from her extensive networks, enabling productive conversations between business, persons with disability and public policymakers. Then we go all the way over to Australia to hear from Catherine Seberg, who is Assistant Commissioner for Inclusion at the Australian Public Service Commission. In this role, Catherine leads a team responsible for supporting agencies across the Australian public service to build and maintain diverse workforces and inclusive work.
Siobhan?
I'm coming back in now. I don't know, I'm so sorry about that. For the first time ever since doing one of the webinars, my technology kicked me out. I hope we got to, I think, where I was introducing Kate. So I will just complete my introduction of Kate and then we'll go very quickly into the opening presentations. So Purple Space leads the Purple Light Up, which is a worldwide global movement to encourage disability employee networks across the globe to go purple in the run-up to the UN International Day of Persons with Disability. The community of change agents was born by demand following the publication of Kate's book, Secrets and Big News, in 2014, which focused on enabling people to be themselves at work. So as I said, we've got a fantastic panel here. Please do send in your questions. And if you want the closed captions, click on the CC icon. Without further ado, though, I'm going to invite Yasmin to give us some opening comments. Over to you, Yasmin.
Thank you so much, Siobhan, and I'm so excited to be here to work with these wonderful fellow panelists, some of whom I know and some of whom I'm looking forward to learn from today. As you mentioned, I'm Canada's first Deputy Minister for Public Service Accessibility, but I'm also the first visibly disabled Deputy Minister in the history of the Canadian Civil Service. When I started in the public service some 30 years ago, there was nobody who looked like me in the senior ranks. So for me, this topic is very personal. My goal is to not be the only one, and for people with disabilities to be seen and to be valued for the talent and the contribution that they bring. And I'll be very candid with you, we still have a way to go. So as Siobhan mentioned, my mandate is all about getting the Canadian Public Service ready to meet or to exceed the requirements of the Accessible Canada Act. We worked in collaboration, hence the title of our strategy, Nothing Without Us, with people with disabilities to design a strategy that would focus on alleviating the major barriers to full inclusion of people with disabilities in the Canadian Public Service. And we know that the biggest challenges remain in the area of employment. The Government of Canada committed to hiring 5,000 new employees with disabilities by 2025. That is a very ambitious goal, but we know that recruitment alone isn't enough. We have to improve the workplace conditions for those currently in the public service and those to come. And so our strategy also puts a huge focus on creating an enabling and welcoming work environment. Because I'm a public servant and we love data, I'm just going to very quickly share some statistics with you. People with disabilities, 22% of the Canadian population. We use a data point called workforce availability to measure how we should be doing. So 22% of the Canadian population lives with a disability, 9% are deemed to be workforce available. So that's the people in the labor market who represent the population from whom we can draw. And for senior executives, that number is 5.3%. Right now, our representation in the senior ranks of the Canadian Public Service of senior executives is about 5.6%. That's good, and it's increased over the last few years. What's behind that? I can speak to that a little bit later, but it may be because of greater efforts to attract and develop people with disabilities. Could also be because of an increase in self-identification, because people are feeling more comfortable. But it's also because of a decrease in the number of retirements. And we've certainly seen that during COVID. We've seen a decrease in retirement rates out of the public service. It'd be interesting to pursue that a little bit. I think in closing, I'll just say, it takes a deliberate and focused effort. It doesn't happen by accident. I think about what we did in the Canadian Public Service to increase the representation of women. And according to Global Government Forum's Women Leaders Index, Canada leads. We're at 48% of our senior leaders in the public service who are women. It did not happen by accident. It took years of deliberate and targeted activities. And we need to take the same approach for people with disabilities. And I would be happy to expand on that later on to talk about some of the actual initiatives we have underway right now so that we will increase the representation in our senior ranks. But I'm going to leave it there, Siobhan, because I'm very keen to hear from my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. Really lovely to start on that personal note, I think, as you say, and why for you it's so important that you increase visibility, especially at the senior ranks. But I think it's a great place to start because you've raised so many issues that I think we will come back to, that the audience will want to follow up on. So the issue around self-identification, issues around recruitment and retention. Also interesting what you said there about retirement rates, maybe being an interesting thing to explore later. And very much, I think what will resonate with people is this doesn't happen by accident. So we've seen progress that's been made in other areas of diversity agenda, such as gender equality. The same focus needs to happen on people with disabilities as well. So thank you. Great place to start, Yasmin. I'm now going to invite Christina for your thoughts.
Oh, wow. It's fantastic to hear, and always very excited when I hear stories like that. But the reality is I'm somebody who wasn't working for 5.5 years because I had 4 operations and I wasn't able to get out there and go back to work. And I really believed I wouldn't be able to. And there's been a shift. So I work for NHS England Improvement, and I'm the lived experience ambassador. And if you're not aware what that term means, I work on the patient experience team, but the reason we called it lived experience is because identifying that with 1.3 million people working in NHS, we must have disabled people within there. We must have people with lived experience of a health condition. Whether they identify as a disability or not is another thing. A lot of people will say, well, I don't claim disability payments, so therefore I'm not disabled. You know, there's lots of different reasons why people don't identify. And I think that goes across any of the protected characteristics that we have. You know, some people just don't like to be labelled and, you know, don't want it's still very much a stigma. And I think through the last 2 years when I joined NHS England, it was all about amplifying the voice of the patient and service users and their carers. But actually I've turned around, and the last 2 years we've had lived experience across the whole world in terms of the pandemic. And with COVID, we have things like long COVID, or it's post-COVID in your area. And the thing is, we're now starting to look at what does that actually mean for our workforce? How can we actually retrain to retain is what I kind of always start thinking about, is that so many people think they've, you know, unfortunately their health, it may be through like me, an accident, I fell off a wall. And so, you know, it's that kind of thing of actually there's different reasons. Like, you know, I didn't actually know I had long-term health conditions from birth. I found that out many years later. So it's looking at each individual and actually looking how can we retain those skills and that knowledge and visibility. Without a doubt, when I came into this role, it was all about being highly visible to you know, make a path to help others, but also to follow the path of people in front of me. But what I realized during COVID is the fact that we have so many staff now who might put down, so they might, you know, on our employment records, you might put down you have a disability, or you might put it on your staff, you know, staff survey, but you don't do it on both. The numbers don't coincide. And the problem is, why don't they coincide? Why are people too worried and too scared to actually speak up? And that comes across, I have both physical mental health conditions. And so just by being visible, by talking about it, little bit by, you know, normalizing it to a certain extent, makes it, if it makes it a little bit easier for the next person, then that's what I'm about. It's about not ever do this journey on your own. It's kind of boring if it is. And actually, you know, I got told by Kate, I'm going to call it out, Kate. She once told me about 3 years ago to find my tribe, but I was in quite a toxic environment. And yeah, and this is how I've ended up here again with you, Kate, 3 years later. So, you know, from a disability summit to here, it's been a journey, and we'll talk about it a bit more, but it's been a roller coaster, and how toxic teams can actually make it really difficult, and how to help people back is a real concern.
Thank you so much, Christina. Really good way to build on what Yasmin said there as well. You touched on some of those same issues, and I see we've already got questions coming in. This issue of self-identification and maybe why some people do and don't want to share that information with other people. We can certainly explore that later in the webinar. I think you raised the impact of COVID as well. That's something I think is really interesting, especially as people are used to working from home and seeing how that can be done. Maybe they had reservations before. But also what you said there about the importance of the data and the statistics. And finally, it's about physical as well as mental health. I think that's something that we shouldn't overlook as well. And all of these things, because today is very much around senior positions in particular, people don't see that from the minute they come into an organisation, all that support around, they're not even going to think about going up to the next levels, I think. So thank you so much. Susan, I'm coming to you next for your thoughts.
Well, thank you very much. And I could talk for another hour and a half here. I'm looking at myself thinking, gosh, what are the most important things here in terms of this focus on senior positions? I suppose what's relevant from my experience is I'm working as an advisor to the German government's International Development Agency, to the ILO's Global Business Disability Network, to Valuable 500, which of course is a private sector initiative, putting the disability equality crisis, if you like, at board level, demanding board level attention. I think senior leaders in public and private sector organizations share some common characteristics. One is they're not comfortable even talking about this issue. I want to challenge the assumption that we start with the statistics, because statistics actually rarely change behavior. You can tell a senior player 20% of that group has a disability, or 1.3 billion people with disabilities, and they say either that's not true, which I have actually had said to me, because he doesn't see 1 in 5 people in wheelchairs on the sidewalk every day, or they go, so what? If I were looking at coaching a senior player in terms of how to enable more significant numbers coming through into senior posts, I'd be saying 1 in 3 people aged 50 to 64 will have a disability. It's quite likely that you've got many more than the 5% that Yasmin quotes in senior roles who have a disability. Asking why they don't take on that identity comfortably might give you some insights into what needs to change in the organization. We had a very senior civil servant in the UK diagnosed with Parkinson's who told me he was very reluctant to tell anyone in the business, in his government department, because he was told his career would be over. What kind of a message does that then send down when you're trying to encourage people to come forward for promotion? Trust is a hugely important dimension here, which links to the extent how you make workplace adjustments, which links to, do you have a culture focused on legal compliance? Understanding our audience is in so many different jurisdictions with so many different expectations around what regulations require. The big message for me is you have to lift above legal compliance into the best practice that says we give everyone the tools and flexibility they need in order to do their best. We remove obstacles when it comes to career development, and that includes disability-specific obstacles. And this all means that we have to have disability and accessibility expertise properly positioned in the business. And we have to have senior players who are saying, we will not tolerate the legal compliance culture that says, I'm only going to treat you properly by making this adjustment if I have to. Now, there isn't a single senior player listening to this event today who wants to send out the message, I'm only going to make adjustments, i.e. treat you fairly so that you can do your job if I'm compelled to by law. And so this debate around enabling people to come up the ladder has to start with the question, what happens when someone asks for the adjustment to the panel that's going to interview them for their promotion? What happens when they're asking for adjustments just to do the job? How is the system actually designed so it's efficient, non-stigmatizing? They can trust you with the information that they do need these adaptations. So I'm going to stop because we need to open up this for other panel members and the conversation. But I suppose what I'd like us to be talking about is how does the senior team convey the trust that they can be trusted, and to start with the question, what happens when people ask us to make the adjustments they need in order to thrive at work, and then start to look more at the more common statistical analysis that sometimes doesn't actually tell you what to do and how to improve the system. And has our marvelous chair has frozen. Oh, she's not going to be happy with this. From Alexa. Okay, we'll just be patient. So I could fill space here, but I think we're supposed to be moving on to the next panel member.
Catherine, maybe you could press ahead and introduce yourself as an idea.
That's an idea. I think that's probably wise. We've no idea how long Siobhan may be out of commission here. Catherine.
Okay, I'm happy to jump in and say good afternoon, good evening, and as it is where I am in Canberra, close to midnight. I would just like to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you tonight from Ngunnawal country, and acknowledge the traditional owners of that country. And I also want to pay respects to any First Nations colleagues that are on the line tonight. I thought I would start with a really quick overview of the Australian context, and a lot of what the other panelists have said resonates very strongly with me and resonates with what's happening in Australia. So for us, while estimates vary, it's generally agreed that at any point in time, more than 1 in 6 Australians is living with disability. Disability has actually been an area of focus in Australia for a couple of reasons recently. You might be aware we're in the midst of an election campaign, and things like funding for our National Disability Insurance Scheme that has come up as an issue. But we're also partway through a Royal Commission into violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation of people with disability. And for those of you on the line that don't have Royal Commissions, they're basically an investigation established by but independent of government, presided over by a senior judicial officer, and they make recommendations. So they're the most serious things that are identified, and certainly the treatment of people with disability is in that category. I think relevantly, and why I mention it, is that one of the things that the Royal Commission's looking at is improving employment outcomes for people with disability. So that it's particularly relevant and will inform some of our work going forward. We've also got a recently released National Disability Strategy, which is kind of our 10-year framework for disability. And all our state and territory governments are signatories to that strategy. But if I kind of move into the Australian public service context, which is the context in which I work, where we have in our workforce about 4.5% of our employees who identify as having a disability. We've got a target of 7% by 2025. If we sort of look up our ranks, we've got about 3.7% of our senior executives currently who identify as having disability. And for us, and I noted the 5,000 figure from Canada for us, that equates to an extra 4,000 that we have to employ to meet our targets. So we, like others have mentioned, we've got a very strong focus on attraction, recruitment and retention, and accessible and inclusive workplace cultures and environments. And obviously our Australian Public Service Disability Employment Strategy acknowledges that there's a really strong interrelationship between those two elements. But if I think sort of specifically about tonight's topic, the strategy does have a focus on career pathways for employees with a disability. Disturbingly, I guess, we know from our annual census results that our employees with disability are less likely to report that they're satisfied with opportunities for career progression. And I guess for us, that means that we need to do more to provide career development support with a particular focus on how we more effectively include employees with disability in sort of our professional development and talent programs, because we're really conscious that career satisfaction and the sense of opportunity are central to retaining employees and to recruiting new employees. So like some of the other panelists have mentioned, we're focused on things like disability disclosure. We're focused on visibility, which is a significant issue for us. You know, you don't aspire to be what you don't see. And so very focused on raising the disability of senior executives with disability. We're also looking at some of our recruitment processes, particularly our affirmative measures recruitment. And I guess the other thing, I think in Australia, like probably most countries, there's really strong competition for skills and shortages, you know, in particular skills across the whole workforce. And we're increasingly aware that if we're not attractive to all potential employees, we won't be able to address the capability gaps we have in our public service. And if we're not attractive to all parts of the Australian economy. So we are getting there in terms of, we think we've got sort of the frameworks and the settings, but there's so much more that we need to do to attract talented candidates with disability to senior roles and to support the career development of our future leaders. We do have a commitment from our senior leadership in the public service and drive from them to do better. And I'm really happy, as other panelists, when we get into questions, to talk about some of the specific initiatives that we're doing in Australia. So I might leave it there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Catherine. And I apologise again for disappearing again. I think it might have something to do with the van that's pulled up outside that's digging up the pavement, and maybe that's causing some trouble with my connection. I hope it won't happen again. Just to recap, thank you, Susan, for your opening remarks. Really good to focus on the trust issue there. And as you say, all those issues beyond just the legal compliance, doing the absolute minimum, and how you know, we should be able to see all those adaptations and adjustments that are required at every stage, so that people can go right through the whole kind of path of their careers. And then, Catherine, really good to hear you say on the focus of the Royal Commission, but still a lot more to be done. And I think some of your challenges mirror what we've heard from Yasmin and others as well. So I think this is a really good forum to share some of those experiences and share some of those challenges. And last but not least, and good to see I haven't disappeared again, so last but not least, over to you, Kate, for your thoughts.
Siobhan, thank you so much. A real delight to join you today. So thank you to you and your team at the Global Government Forum to join an esteemed panel today. And indeed everybody for dialing in, or indeed watching this or listening on demand. Really appreciate your interest in a topic that is really, really important. So briefly, I have the great pleasure of heading up Purple Space. We're a unique global business with three key objectives. The first is to build disability confidence inside organisations, and we do that by the delivery of world-class know-how in how you set up and then sustain high-performing disability employee resource groups, whether from the public or the private sector. Secondly, we look to connect those disability networks around the world so that we can build community and unity of presence when it comes to the lived experience of employees with disability. And then thirdly, we choose to deliver the assets, the tools, the tricks, the flicks, and the techniques for individuals to build inner confidence and to navigate their working worlds confidently and indeed expectantly that their organisations want to do well by them. We deliver to 2,000 leaders, and we estimate conservatively that we touch the lives of 1 million employees with disability around the world. So for me, very quickly, I know our audience will want to jump in. There's 4 things on my mind when it comes to this topic, and 4 factors really that get in the way of increasing the number of disabled senior leaders. I think the first is the profound challenge of preserving, protecting, indeed enhancing our brands as high-performing employees when we choose to identify with the experience of disability. There is nowhere to go to learn this stuff. There is no brand school. You know, doctors don't provide that. Our wonderful non-disabled friends and family don't provide that. Doctors, social workers, there's no home or school to learn how you navigate the challenges, the soft bigotry of low expectations. So we have to make that up often as we go along. I think the second factor is we're only just starting what we call the 3rd phase of change at Purple Space. The first we call the legislation, started in the States, went across to the UK, and thanks to the UN. And I'm sure everybody, or nearly everybody dialing in, will live and work in countries where there is legislation to ensure that employers do the right thing and tap into talent. Second phase is where employers tap into the enabling products in order to build an accessible and a better working world. And the 3rd phase is what we call the employee movement. And we're only just starting to see the emergence of the disabled employee movement. There's a huge growth in the disability employee resource group movement. And I suppose it's part in comment of our readiness to find our tribes, as Christina said. And, you know, that's not to suggest that we are one identity only. As human beings, we carry many identities, but there's a huge appetite now for employees with disability to work together and to skill up together, and that movement is starting to become a life force. Thirdly, I think there's still a reliance on concepts, I suppose, mindsets, frameworks that suggest that sharing information about our identity of disability is as much or more about the individual readiness of that person to share, as opposed to an organisation's ability to earn trust. And I think that's fundamentally flawed. So, you know, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that. Plus an insistence on using really outdated language like disclosure and declaration. We don't recognise that language. And, you know, I think that it betrays a deep-seated belief that the human experience should be a secret if we choose the word disclosure or if we talk about declaration, you know. So, and then lastly, I think specifically the underinvestment in personal development training within organisations, to be with our tribe, to learn with our tribe, and really to skill up the ways in which we navigate that soft bigotry of low expectation. It's not about fixing us, not on the contrary, it's about how do we choose to either invest in ourselves or our employees to endure the fact, perhaps, that others might think and feel different thoughts about us. So, you know, there's a real underinvestment in the personal development of people with disabilities within organisations. You don't really see that with other people characteristics. And I'd like to see as much investment in personal development than there is in the training of non-disabled line managers or some of the unconscious bias flim-flam that exists. So if we can start to see a shift of spend, I think we'll start to see the growth of that community and unity. Anyway, I shall shush Siobhan back to you. Very excited to be here today.
Thank you, Kate. And I mean, what a fascinating way to end those initial presentations, on so much food for thought there. But the phrase that you said twice, which really stuck with me, that soft bigotry of low expectations, I think that summarizes so much of what we are talking about today. And you picked on, I think, issues that I know Susan mentioned as well, the kind of lack of investment in training and personal development for people with disabilities as well, a really key issue. And I know, Catherine, you said as well, you know, that the kind of loss of talent if we're going to be filling all of those skills gaps across the public sector. It's just such a shame, such a waste as well. So many issues there. Thank you for your brilliant opening remarks. We've had so many questions coming in already. I want to start just by getting the conversation going, though, picking up on this issue, because you all mentioned it in your presentations, this issue of sharing information about a disability that you have. As you said, Kate, the language sometimes around that in itself is problematic, whether it's declaration or disclosure, but maybe sharing information about a disability. Can I just ask to all of you then, before we go to questions from the audience, you mentioned some of it, Kate, but I want to unpick it a little bit. Do you think are the main reasons why people feel they can't share that information in the workplace? And especially given what we're talking about today, Susan, you touched on this, why are people at senior levels, when we know statistically that many of them will have a disability of one type or another, not feeling that they can share that information? What is going on? I'm going to change the ordering a little bit. Catherine, I'm going to come to you first for your thoughts on this one.
Thank you. Look, I think there seem to be a lot of reasons, and I think some of them are deeply personal for people, and so I guess I'm talking about some general things that I think that we have noticed in the APS, but absolutely not a exclusive list. I think there are some things that are potentially positives and some that are negatives in this space. So we find that some of our employees don't share their disability status because they don't feel that they need any reasonable adjustments in the workplace. So there's no reason for them to share. But on the sort of more, I guess, negative side of the ledger, we are concerned that negative experiences in other workplaces, as other panelists have mentioned, fear of consequences of disclosing or sharing, and the impact that might have on their future career. We also have some technical issues in the APS, in that we have this huge discrepancy between people who disclose in anonymous survey and on our HR systems, and we don't know to some extent. We don't know the extent to which that discrepancy is to do with our HR systems as well. So there's some technical issues that we want to unpack, but I really think that a safe and accepting workplace and fear of consequences is probably driving quite a bit of it. And a little bit of a lack of clarity for some people around what constitutes a disability, and this comes up as well.
Great,
for us.
I'm going to continue with this same question because I want everybody's thoughts on this. I want to add in though, because it's Sarah Stock has asked, how can I support people who have long-term health conditions that affect their ability or views of their ability, but who may not want to share the information, so they don't want to define themselves as having a disability? Because I think that's connected as well. And you were nodding to some of those things that Catherine said, and for you, I know you really want to stress that you would like more people at senior levels to be sharing this information. What do you think is stopping them from doing that?
Did you address Yasmin?
Yeah,
or?
sorry, Susan, to you.
Oh, me. Oh, I thought I was expecting Yasmin.
I'm mixing up the order a little bit.
Okay. Well, the point I was making about the legal compliance culture, if you're being encouraged to share the information that you have a disability, often the next question is, prove it. Well, that's very different as an environment than the reason I need you to tell me I need you to tell me what you need so you can do the job. I don't need to know the name of your diagnosis or your doctor's note. The point is, what can we do to make it easier for you to do your job? And not forcing someone who thinks they have a health condition to describe themselves as having a disability in order to trigger a legal obligation to give them what they need, which makes it easier for them to do the job. For me, that's absolutely fundamental. The other thing, of course, would be the trust that you see there is the trust that would also enable them to give you to describe themselves as having a disability later, but trust is built over time. You don't trust someone, hello, Christine, I now trust you because I've now met you. No, it takes a year, maybe, especially if I'm asking you to do stuff that's related to very personally for me. So you give me what I need, and then a year later, I might be much more comfortable saying, yes, I do have a disability because I've got evidence now that you're not going to deny me a future career. The other thing I would say is I once met a very senior guy, chair of a huge company. I was telling him that a bank recently opened 9,000 workstations with 9,000 right-handed mice. And so 10% of the workforce was at risk of getting lousy wrists and maybe becoming disabled over time with surgery, et cetera. And he said, you mean there are left-handed mice? So that was an interesting observation first. But the second thing is, would you require the chairman of, it was KPMG at the time, to go to your occupational health physician to prove that he might be at risk of becoming disabled? Does the law require you to give left-handed mice to people who are only at risk of becoming disabled? They're not disabled yet. It's nonsense, isn't it? You just give people the left-handed mouse they need. So we need workplace adjustment procedures and services that quickly and efficiently give people what they need so that over time they can trust you with the information.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. Kate, I'm going to come back to you on the same issue because you started your 4 points by saying it's hard when people are building their brand, maybe, to share this information. Is that what you see as being one of the biggest barriers?
Yes, absolutely, Siobhan, and building on Susan's words, you know, last year Purple Space prepared a publication called 5 Trust Tests. So we straw polled our membership and beyond, and we asked employees with disability, what are the clues that they look for of their employer before they choose to share information about their disability? And they came up with 5 things. One, they look to see whether their organisation chooses to learn directly from their own people. That might come, of course, from disability employee resource groups. We're a huge fan. I'm slightly biased, but that could also come from listening groups or focus groups. There's a whole range of ways where organisations can systemically and systematically test out the views of their people, but then they have to come back and say what they're doing with those views. The second clue that employees look for is senior business leaders with a senior responsibility for digital access. You know, what's happening on the AI front that Susan leads on, what's happening to preserve and protect some of the best features of working from home and hybrid working. The third clue, it's not rocket science, and you know, we've had legislation for a wee while now. This is about the ability for organisations to deliver swiftly, elegantly, workplace adjustments. End of. This is not rocket science. So all individuals will look for clues by which organisations can deliver workplace adjustments under SLA, service level agreements. You know, why wait for an ergonomic mouse that costs less than £200 and, you know, waiting for maybe 9 months? You know, as a woman, we expect maternity leave. We simply tell our employer 15 weeks before we have a baby, and we expect everything to happen. Why is it disabled? So they're looking for those clues. And then the other 2, they look for their organisations to use external levers. That might be signing up to Valuable 500 or taking part in forums like the one you lead, Siobhan, or it might be organisations that choose to sign up to the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and to look at where disability fits in that, or it may be that they take part in International Day of Persons with Disabilities and Purple Light Up. And then lastly, employees are increasingly looking for clues about how their employers are choosing to invest in them in the same way they're choosing to invest in their female leaders, their BAME leaders or their LGBT plus leaders, to how much investment is going into individuals to navigate. So it's not just about our ability to share personal information, that trust, the ability to earn the trust by doing the legwork is a huge role in that.
Thanks, Kate. Yasmin, there's been a lot said. Did you want to add anything on the issues of trust, on investment in people, on listening to people? What do you think are the biggest barriers here?
I think it's such a great question, and I think it's very multi-pronged in terms of the reasons why people choose not to self-disclose. For sure, fear of discrimination and stigma, I think, is at the top of the list. I've heard so much from our employees with invisible disabilities, how terrified they are of disclosing, because they see what happens to people who are visibly disabled and they think, oh my goodness, I don't want that to happen to me. But then what the risk there is that somebody who may have a learning disability, or who may be dealing with an acquired brain injury and has issues with lighting, doesn't disclose, and then they become considered a performance problem. And they actually are at risk of losing their job because they don't disclose. So it's a terrible situation for somebody to be in. I think the other thing, though, is a reluctance to be labeled. It's related to identity politics. Which identity do I choose? Because I'm told, well, are you disabled? And somehow I have to pick my primary identity. And the way similar to Australia, we have two different ways of measuring. We have the annual employment equity survey that every federally regulated organization is required to produce. And that's how we get our official representation numbers. But we also do an annual employee engagement survey. And the results of that one, our self-identification rates are at least 2% higher in the less formal, anonymous public service employee survey, which tells you something. I do think it's both. It's fear of discrimination, but I also think it's a resistance to be labeled and forced to pick an identity. And my colleagues in the Office of the Chief Human Resources Officer are actually completely transforming our whole approach to self-identification and making it more of a campaign where people are encouraged to have pride in their multiple identities. So you're not forced to pick one, you pick many, and it's not about what's wrong with you. It's about tell us who you are and how you identify, which is a very different way of getting at it. And I think that also helps to alleviate some of the stigma. And to Kate's point, starts to build some of the trust, because it's about pride and it's not about what's wrong with you.
Thanks, Jasmine. So many of those issues around identity and branding and how you can be more than one thing at one time. Really, really interesting. Christina, I've left you to last to answer this particular question, because I also want to bring in a question that came in from Anna McShane, which was directed at you. And Anna said, thank you for being so candid, talking about your own experience. And what tips would you give for how you approach a toxic environment? You mentioned that, and maybe if you're working in an unlightened team or an unlightened environment, which I think links to some of this fear of sharing information about your disability.
Leave. That's what I did. So it was a matter of finding a safer space for me. I try to go back, and the first word that came to mind about why people don't disclose was fear. I think there is a level of, if people are at senior roles, it's a sign of weakness, because it's a real generational thing. I believe that actually when people are senior leaders, they're obviously top of their game. They're like, out there, seen as that strong, character. And say there is a life-changing condition or an accident, or whatever it is, and all of a sudden it's that kind of losing a part of yourself. Because I know that I grieved about my health, and I grieved about those 6 months of not walking at all, but I'm much further down the line that I'm like, actually I used to burn the candle at both ends and in the middle. So it was something that stopped me, and it literally did stop me for 6 months. So and I wouldn't be here talking about the things I'm talking about. I was an IT consultant, I had a very different life. I was a project manager. And so being in a space where you are not in a toxic environment. If you can move, I would recommend it. I stayed 2.5 years and it didn't do my mental health any good, but actually it taught me so much about how not to do things. So, you know, if you're there and another employee is asking somebody, you know, why have you got a special chair? You're only here for 15 hours. That is a red flag for me. You know, you don't just like ignore it, just like you wouldn't ignore racism, just like you wouldn't ignore a sexist comment. And so it was touched on a little bit about intersectionality. It's like, actually, which label should I choose today? Because I tick a lot of boxes, but actually I'm just Christina, and, you know, I quite like being me. So you know, it's that kind of thing of all the different factors and how you can embrace it, but it takes a long time, and it's not always, you know, when you're in lots of pain and the last thing you want to do is even get out of bed, and you've got, you know, and you just think, oh, why me? And there'll always be days like that, but I think it's human nature. But to help somebody else who's it is being, I don't particularly like the word ally because it's just another buzzword, isn't it? So it's just about just being kind and being aware that actually can happen to you tomorrow. I said it to a room full of, you know, psychiatrists and psychologists that actually, you know, you can all go down the road and break a leg or break an ankle like I did, or you could just go down the road and have a breakdown. And their mouths dropped because it was like, oh, how could that possibly happen to us? You know, and a reality is it could happen to anybody at any point. So that having that human kindness and realizing that actually, you know, if you think about you know, if you have grandparents or great grandparents, that, you know, when people have been looked after in the family, say, or, you know, it was just natural. Would they have called themselves disabled? Potentially not, because it was a generational thing. And I think there's much more acceptance of talking about things. I think the more we talk about things, it will slowly change things, but I think we're a long way off. And I think it depends on the team, very much so. I'm now very much in a very safe space. I have a great team that absolutely everybody knows that Christina's going to go in and talk about her health, because that's part of my role. And it's kind of like, you know, it's acceptance of that. Although it's triggering for other people. Why is it so uncomfortable for other people to talk about my accident, or for me to talk about my mental health? Why does that make somebody else fearful? Because I'm still Christina, you know, my triggers aren't daytime, so you're fine unless you're with me overnight. So the reality is, why should you be fearful of that? And I think it's a level of, I'm going to say, a level of ignorance that people don't talk to each other. And I think if anybody is in a toxic situation, you need those disability groups so people can get peer support. I'm a real believer. So, okay, I keep going about building the tribe. I'm always going about it. But actually, if you have those people that you can go to, there's another senior leader going, look, this is happening to me. You know, how did you deal with it? It's just having that kind of person to bat it off. Because if somebody hasn't got a disability, they won't know. So not the same way.
That importance of those networks around you, people who can support you as well in the workplace. Just to say, we're getting a lot of love in for all of you in the panel. So Tanya has said, Susan Scott Parker is my hero. You would have remained in Canada, as I would love to work with someone like you. So,
Oh, can I just leave now then while I'm ahead?
Nice to hear. I'm going to come back to the issue of mental health, actually, because we've had questions around that as well. So and that has come up in a moment. But I want to come back to another thing that you've all kind of touched on, I think, which is the issue of kind of adjustments and reasonable adjustments and adaptations in the workplace. And we've had a question from Milton, who says, it's a pity that people with disabilities who can yield more production and profit are often passed over for somebody who is less productive. The cost of adapting in the workplace is quickly earned, Milton has said. But even at the top, there are positions where people who aren't as good as people with disabilities are getting those positions. So I think the question buried in there is, do you think some of the resistance to putting in place reasonable adjustments or adaptation is because people think these are going to be too expensive? And I also want to put in alongside this the issue of hybrid working. Are people now worried that we're going to have to kind of double up on adjustments? So people will need, you know, to adapt their workplace at home as well as in the office. So your thoughts really on the cost of adaptations. I'm going to come to Kate first, because you're nodding on this, Kate.
That'll serve me right.
Don't nod.
There's different pockets and pockets of evidence about the average cost of a workplace adjustment. Some of the work that Microlink has done is fantastic, But broadly, the price, wherever you look around the world, anything between £400 and £700, maybe a little bit more over here and a little bit less over here. And of course, some of us cost a wee bit more, and others of us will cost a lot less, £1.73 for an easy grip pen. And I think, the challenge here is often individuals don't always know the adjustments that they might need. And of course, while the legislation is there to protect us, and we're now in some parts of the world 20 years beyond the legislation, we have a cohort of individuals who are growing up, youngsters who are growing up in a climate where they kind of understand that the Act exists, even if they don't know the letter of the law. And yet, when or if we experience disability, I think particularly those of us who may transition from being a non-disabled person to having a disability, 86% of all people with disabilities will acquire that human experience through the course of their working life. So we're morphing our identities. And, Yasmin spoke so beautifully about the more sophisticated approaches that we're seeing to recognise that, of course, we have multiple identifiers. So to come back to your question on costs, they are negligible, I think. Certainly a lot less than perhaps women. We've got an all-women panel here. For those of us around the room who may enjoy maternity leave, for example, that is a much more costly adjustment for our employers than the average cost for a disabled employee. But we're worried about inconvenience often. I think individuals who may be asked for workplace adjustment, they don't know that they're mandated to deliver. They don't always know where to go. It's quite rare. Susan's done a lot of work on this. It's very rare to see organisations that have chosen courageously to centralise the budget when it comes to workplace adjustments, to make it easier for local line managers not to have to be troubled as to whether they can afford that cost. Because although, as I say, £1.73 is negligible, others of us will need a more costly adjustment. So how do you differentiate your employees? So it's hard. Nobody wants to be a burden. I have not yet really met any person who wants to be a burden at work, and it can take sometimes 2, 3, 4 years for somebody to even articulate a need. So I would love to see more work to make it easier for individuals to know just how low these costs really are, as well as supporting people to know that these are not favours. These are not favours.
Thanks, Kate. So Susan, I'm going to come straight to you, given as Kate mentioned the work you've done on this area.
Well, and Yasmin has done outstanding work, survey across the entire population that works for the Government of Canada. But a couple of quick points. We need to put this into perspective. I think the cost is primarily a psychic cost of having to learn to do things differently. And look at the cost of not delivering an efficient workplace adjustment service. Needless absenteeism, because if you'd given the person what they needed quickly, they would never have taken all that time off. You enhance productivity. Look at the costs associated with managing not just litigation, but formal grievances. As people say, I asked for this adjustment 6 months ago. It's not happening. My manager says he keeps trying and we can't make it work. So who manages the formal grievance? The same HR department that actually people kind of assumed was responsible for making adjustments, but they haven't got the authority to get the IT guys to respond quickly. They can't get the facilities people to respond quickly when they need a soap dispenser moved. That's a Yasmin story that we don't have time to go through. So the cost of actually getting it wrong is absenteeism, an unhappy workforce, an unengaged workforce. You're losing good people who give up and leave, not just because it's toxic, but because it feels toxic because they can't get what they need. The question for every manager should be, how can we make it easier for everybody to do their job? That's what we're trying to do with this. And what we know is that if you rely on HR to make it happen, it won't happen. You need to have an understanding that you have to work across all the departments that are responsible for responding when people need a whole range of things. There are only 7 kinds of adjustments you need, except for the one in the brain that says, let's do it. And we know what they are. And that actually the real challenge here is you do not make line managers have to pay. Inevitably, you get delay. You have a single place to go and everybody knows where it is to say, this is what I need, not, oh, and this is my doctor's note. You do not require people who are blind to see a doctor to prove they need a Braille keyboard. You trust them, et cetera, et cetera. And so happy to share some of the work that we've done in this. You'll see on the Global Business Disability Network, there's some webinars and some decks and stuff we've done looking at the principles that underpin an efficient workplace adjustment service. And it works for everybody. It's not just for people with disabilities. Everybody needs the right tools and they need the right level of flexibility.
Thanks, Susan. We'll make sure we send those links to those to that work to everybody that's registered and attending this webinar today. Thanks so much. Yasmin, you were mentioned there twice, as somebody who's done a lot of work. I want to ask though, because I'm going to ask you and Catherine and Christina as individuals who are sitting in public sector organisations, even though we've heard from Kate and Susan about the kind of business case for these adjustments, in reality, is the money there when people ask for the adjustments that they need?
Well, that's an interesting question. So I'm going to back up a little bit before I get to that. So in the Canadian system, it's been a totally decentralized model. It was the hiring manager who was responsible for both approving the workplace accommodation and paying for it. So imagine how many people have to actually deal with workplace accommodations issues in the course of managing a team. It's not that, so how are they going to develop expertise? What we find is that in the Canadian context, a lot of these requests are dealt with through what's called the labor relations group. That's where conflict is dealt with in the workplace. So imagine you're the person with a disability and you're being told, I have to go to the place where they deal with grievances and problems, but all I want is a height adjustable desk or screen reading software. Why am I being seen as a problem? So like imagine the angst that creates for the individual. So we're trying to change that. And what we're doing right now is we're piloting something called a workplace accommodation passport. And it's going to be for all Government of Canada employees. And it doesn't talk about what's wrong with you. It asks the employee, what are the barriers that are preventing you from making your best contribution in the workplace? And it creates a conversation between the employee and the manager is there to support the employee and say, how can I support you to eliminate those barriers? What do you need? We've tried to make the costs as streamlined as possible. We have, in some departments, it is being centralized, so completely centralized. We're testing different models in different departments because we have gigantic departments with a presence right across the country. We have tiny little agencies. So we're looking at different models that might work in different situations. But the passport is intended to be used right across the public service. And it means that those accommodations accompany the employee. So you don't have to relitigate every time you change jobs, which will help to unblock some of the challenges we have right now around promotions, people not wanting to present themselves for a new job because they're afraid they might not get what they need. So we think this is actually the key to unlock many of the challenges that our employees with disabilities face.
Thanks, Jen. I mean, it sounds like such a simple thing, but such a huge difference. Christina, your thoughts on the cost of adjustments?
You know, for me, I absolutely love the passport because it's all about what matters to me. So that my team, but you know, within the NHS, I've worked in 2 different, acute trusts and also now on the national team, and both had access to work, which is a scheme over in England, so that to enable me to have those reasonable adjustments, and percentage, a big chunk of the money is paid by essentially by the government. But actually 2 very different experiences. Again, it came down to a lack of awareness of the process. So there wasn't a process in place, and the people being unclear. And then an element of, well, if they have that, why can't I have something? And there was that kind of, it is, what do people need? You wouldn't send somebody into a kitchen who's a chef without knives, would you? Without tools, whatever the job is, you need your tools, right? So reasonable adjustments, I'm really fortunate. So, but I have been in a situation where it took 9 months, and then I found out my actual, laptop had gone to somebody else because they decided they needed it more than me. May add, they had no disability, and so I only found out after I left. And it's just those things that it sometimes is toxic, but it's also people having a, well, if they've got it, I want it kind of attitude. But the other side of it is not knowing the process. It's not knowing the process, and oh, I don't know it. I'm scared to ask that or say that I don't know it, so I'll just ignore it for a little while longer. But I'm still going to need that, that whatever it is. So it's a struggle, isn't it?
Yeah, which goes to this, you shouldn't have to if you've gone through the whole process of negotiating a package of support, you shouldn't have to do it again every time you move. Catherine, the idea of kind of the cost of adjustments, also passports, is that something that you're also doing in Australia?
Yes, it is. So I think for us, there is very high level support across government for the employment of people with disability. Cost will be an issue at times, but I think what some of the barriers for us are around things like ICT systems. So we're also in a very decentralized environment. Our departments all have their own systems in place. And so some of that movement around, there are sort of structural things that make it more difficult. So we're kind of looking at our disability passport idea as well. Some agencies have them internally so people can move around within the agency. But how we sort of do that across the system, and also how we standardize some of our things so that things can be taken across departments. The other thing I just wanted to mention, because the conversation around not knowing what you need really resonates, and we hear that a lot. And manager capability and helping managers work with people with disability to identify what adjustments they might need. We've recently rolled out a disability contact officer guidance. So each agency is encouraged to establish disability contact officers in their agency. So people with a disability can talk to and perhaps work through some of those issues with, who can provide support and guidance, in addition to the work we need to do around uplifting manager capability and being clearer around what we can offer, because sometimes you don't ask for what you don't know is available. Yeah.
Thanks, Catherine. Sure, Susan.
Can I just come in very quickly?
Yeah.
Always when we talk about the cost, I'm asking myself, have we forgotten that we make adjustments because that's how you deliver disability equality?
Yes.
The point is, it's about equality. And every piece of legislation that is influenced by the CRPD says it's a reasonable accommodation. So if a waitress you've just hired says, I need to work from home, well, that's not reasonable. That would cost a lot because you'd have to replace her with a waitress in the restaurant. You don't ask people to do that. So the question first is, how do we ensure equal opportunities? And this is in a world where the language of diversity and inclusion is, it morphed into all that vagueness. It's about equality. And that's where I think you cut back the costs associated with managing formal grievances, because people feel that they're being treated fairly. And that changes all your employee engagement. Yeah.
Shifts the whole conversation as well, doesn't it? Thank you. I can't believe how fast the time is going. So I want to get in at least 2 more questions. So we might have to pick our answers a little bit, but there are a couple of questions coming in I'm going to link together here. And I think when people think about maybe disability in the workplace, the first thing they might think about is physical disabilities. But we've had a couple of questions in that are more about kind of neurological or mental health issues. So first one from Corey Ruff, who said, are there any procedures, whether in development or being used currently, for accommodating people with neurological and mental health disabilities in hiring and promotion procedures? So that's specifically about, they're asking because they only know of kind of being offered kind of quiet locations for written tests or anything, but not really more adjustments other than that. And then I want to link that to a question from Emily Prieur, who also talks about being somebody that has a learning disability, who might need things repeated in the workplace, has ADHD, so maybe things a bit longer for Emily to do. And is there a way of finding the balance between the way we treat people who might need kind of additional help with some of the more mental health issues or neurological kind of issues? So I want your thoughts on this. Is this something that's even less talked about perhaps than some of the more physical side of things? Christina, I'm going to start with you first.
Well, I think there is so much stigma, isn't there, about mental health and, you know, people not wanting to address the subject anyway. And then with neurodiversity, it is something that people make assumptions. So, you know, I think it's very personalized. Your disability and where you are today with your disability could be very different to how you are next week or last week, depending on pain levels or depending on what other things you have, you know. So I think in terms of your mental health, sometimes your mental health, your environment you're working in isn't helping. So if you're not got an environment where you can talk about your disability, the impact on keeping that in, not being able to talk up when you have, you know, having a difficult day, that really takes its toll. And so it can be triggering lots of different ways. It triggered my PTSD. You know, I'm really fortunate that I have a team that it's already factored into my one-to-ones, my support, because the reasonable adjustments are in place. And having a line manager who understands, if we're doing a presentation, there are certain, well, oh no, how do you know, can the pass it? Because my brain's just gone, you know, and there's a bit of brain fog. And usually, if I wasn't recovering from COVID, I'd be 100 miles per hour and you'd be asking me to slow down. So it's having a team that understands each other, but you need to feel safe to be able to talk about what you need. And sometimes you might not know what you need. So that's the thing.
Yeah, because Emily has mentioned in particular, she's saying, for example, if there's an urgent project on, she might need things repeated quite a lot. She might need a bit longer to do it, whereas she recognises that everyone else is also super, needs to kind of hit the deadlines. To what extent can she expect them to make that adjustment to accommodate what she needs? Catherine, I'm going to come to you for your thoughts on these kind of issues.
Well, I think I'd start by saying it goes to what others have said around knowing your teams, really understanding what they need, having managers who've got the capability and the understanding to support their teams. And look, I think when it comes to neurodiversity, for example, and for potentially also mental illness, some people don't identify as having a disability. They may say I'm neurodiverse. That doesn't necessarily equate with having a disability. So there's a language thing there that we need to be kind of careful with. And I really like the point around it's actually just about enabling the best from everyone and not kind of having to classify someone as having a disability. We're definitely thinking about neurodiversity in the recruitment space and how we make our recruitment processes more suitable for people with neurodiversity, from things like the way we ask questions, the time we give people. But again, we've got a long way to go because you know, you don't ask for what you don't know is available, and we haven't been very good at letting people know what's available and what reasonable adjustments we can make.
Thanks, Catherine. Yasmin, I could see you look very sympathetic to what Catherine was saying there. Does that resonate with you as well?
Well, I just wanted to share that we're doing some really interesting work in the Canadian Public Service around neurodiversity, because we know we're not very good at it. And so we're actually working with a company that is helping us both do recruitment, very targeted recruitment of neurodiverse talent. But the companion piece is, how do you actually equip a workplace to be able to be welcoming to people who are neurodiverse? And so there's a whole bit of training and development that needs to go into building that sense of supportive teams. So, we often put the focus on how do we develop the individual, but we also need to develop the managers and the teams who are going to be working with people who have disabilities or are neurodiverse. It's totally important. And we often put too much emphasis on how do we deal with the person who's coming in, and not enough on how do we build that welcoming and supportive environment. And so that we're working on both the recruitment side, but also the environmental side. And I think it's, I wish we did that for everybody. We would be a much better and more productive workplace.
Thanks, Yasmin. Kate, I'm going to come to your thoughts on kind of neurodiversity, mental health issues.
Yeah, I think some of this is about, notwithstanding Yasmin's point, which is, absolutely a fact. I think there is no doubt when we look in our community that, a lot of that cohort will lack the confidence because they don't have that physical badge. So they're having to share a little bit of who they are and the challenges that they have without any visible badge that they tick that box. We do a lot of work around confidence. So let me answer the question in terms of the work that we've been doing about how you build inner confidence. As human beings, we often frame confidence as either a fact, you've got it or you haven't got it, or a feeling, or indeed an act. And we all know that from time to time, if we lack confidence, we might deliver an act. Whereas at Purple Space, for us, the definition of confidence is a strong expectation of a positive outcome. And, in the research at Secrets of Big News, we noticed that some people will wait up to 4 years before they even make an ask, and even longer for those people who may have an unseen or invisible impairment like mental ill health or neurodiversity. So there's a lot of individuals who are making sense of who they are, what their human experience is all about, and their view of whether their employer is ready to hear their truth or aspects of their truth. So, for us, it's about, how can we support people to be more confident in their ask? Because, we believe that confidence is a mindset. And, if our definition is confidence is a strong expectation, you actually need that. It's a precursor before you secure the workplace adjustment. You have to believe in the outcome in order to be successful in that. And because of the narrative, for all the reasons we've discussed, it's incredibly hard to keep hanging on to that belief. So that's why storytelling campaigns are so important. That's why role modeling is so deeply important. That's why hearing and seeing very visible, courageous, sassy leaders like Yasmin and others in the room, Christina and others, is an incredibly important part of the process of believing and normalising human difference as a part of work.
Thanks, Kate. And Susan, anything to add on this from your experience? Do you think organisations are worse at dealing with bringing kind of adjustments for these kinds of invisible maybe disabilities than they are physical ones?
Well, I don't know if we can compare, but they certainly struggle with this. And I think just to focus slightly differently, perhaps on the organization, building on what Yasmin was saying, we're asking the team leaders, the managers, the supervisors, to understand this isn't special treatment. This is about empowering a team of people to do their best at work. And that actually, this individual needs to come in at 10 because of whatever non-visible need they've got. This person has a 90-year-old mother and needs to come in at 10 because of her caring responsibilities. That one needs to come in at 11. And the trick for the mature manager is to figure out how to make it all tick together. And the organizational obligation is to give them the skills and the liberty, the freedom to take the decision sensibly without being constrained by all kinds of policies coming in from HR that say you're off for 3 days. Ooh, mandatory, you've got to go into disciplinary. Oh, it was because of your arthritis. Tough. The policy says 3 days. Yeah. So we need to say the power to say yes has to be as close to the ground as we can get it here. The more managers can say, of course you can come in at 10, but remember, George has to come in at 11. So you have to be here by 10:15 at the latest, because we haven't got the balance right here yet. So managers need to be able to say yes. And we need to look at the policies and procedures that prevent the flexibility that we're really talking about here, and to get that message across. It isn't just special treatment. This is how we're supposed to treat everybody in order to get the best for us as employees and for the organization.
Thanks, Susan. It's interesting because I think you just kind of answered this, and Yasmin touched on this in a previous answer. So Ellis has written, how do you shift out of compliance culture when many situations for employee adjustments are managed within a relations environment, and what you're saying of that environment?
And I do think it's absolutely crucial, if you want to move into best practice, not a legal compliance culture, is you take the implicit assumption that this is an HR issue out.
Yeah.
It isn't about HR. HR is part of the problem. They have to learn to adapt things and beyond. But this is not to be managed by HR, because their primary obligation is to minimize legal risk, even though, oddly enough, they enhance legal risk often by the way they manage this.
We've got time for one more question. I just want to say thank you to the audience for sending in such brilliant questions. We haven't been able to answer absolutely all of them, but we will make sure if there are any left, we'll try and get those answered for you behind the scenes when the webinar has finished. Also to say there will be a questionnaire coming if you're in the audience. Please do take a couple of minutes to fill that questionnaire. I'd be really grateful if you do. It just means we can give you exactly the type of webinars that are most useful for you. So I'd be hugely grateful to do that. But my final question, I want to kind of leave on a positive note. There's been lots of positive stuff here today, and not to say there hasn't been, but I've got a question in from Balwinder Kaur, who has asked, how do we support organizations to make reasonable adjustments in a timely manner? Are there any good examples of organizations that we could link with? So I think this is just opportunity to kind of say, where's the good best practice on this at the moment, or maybe public sector organizations be from others. I'm going to come to Christina. Anything that you would like to say on this?
The NHS is a massive beast, isn't it? So there'll be pockets of good. Where I'm in NHS England, without a doubt, I do believe the Dawn network that we have is really supportive to staff, but I think it goes back down to teams. I haven't actually had any interaction with HR in terms of any reasonable adjustments, so I'm going to pass it over.
Okay, I'm going to come to Catherine. Catherine, aside from the great stuff you're doing across the APS, where else should people look for good practice in this area?
I think everybody's struggling with the same things. I'm part of a network of employers in Australia that come together to talk about disability issues in private, public sector, not-for-profit, and everybody is talking about the same things. I completely agree. It almost goes down to a team level. There's pockets of it in the APS that do this well, and there are pockets in the APS that do it really, really badly. But I think that everybody is struggling with the same issues.
Well, hopefully, I'm going to come to all the panel members, but hopefully maybe one of the things that we can do here in Global Government Forum maybe is help gather up some of that good practice and help share it across the global community. Susan, your thoughts on this, because you do work with lots of different organisations across the public and private sector.
I think that in the private sector, we are seeing organizations like GSK, the pharmaceutical, pioneering, because this is pioneering in large organizations, a centralized approach to roll out a workplace adjustment service that meets consistent best practice standards. We've got some work done in terms of what are the 12 critical success factors that a design has to look like and so on. But if you're talking about large institutions, as everyone's saying, we're in the early stages. At least we're diagnosing, the work that Yasmin's done in terms of the diagnostic work about what happens when, what's getting in the way, that's starting to make real headway. You can see in the public sector in the UK, a significant investment in the technology task force. Organizations like HMRC, DWP, and so on, looking at the role of the CTO or the CIO in terms of enabling the accommodations that are delivered through technology and to stop buying inaccessible technology in the first place. And we are seeing some interest with the ANZ Bank in Australia bringing a procurement task force together to look at the role of procurement. I keep coming back to everything I've just said, reinforcing the message, this isn't HR. It requires almost a chief productivity officer being invented at the C-suite. Someone who's saying, we have to be more productive. We have to enhance productivity. We have to cut sickness absence. And we have to cut all the legal stuff. And that means we have to give people the tools faster. Yeah. So I think we're seeing an interest in the restructuring and the learning, but I can't pull out a lot of examples of best practice.
Okay, well, there's more to be done there, isn't there? Kate, is that your thinking as well?
Yes, and it's a great question from Belwinder. To build on that, as well as GSK, but Lloyds Banking Group is another private sector example where they brought down their delivery of a workplace adjustment, I think, to something like 30 days. And, that may have shifted upwards or downwards, but they really led the march on this. For me, one great best practice example is of the border force, part of the Home Office here in the UK, where as part of their strategy to better improve the timeline of their delivery of workplace adjustments, they chose that they wanted to normalise experience of disability via storytelling campaigns. So they invested in their people, they had some of their senior leaders talk extensively and candidly and unflinchingly of their personal experiences of disability as a way of encouraging others to say it's okay. An incredibly challenged industry. We talked about passports in our world. This is about, really stretched industry as part of the Home Office. And a lot of people felt incredibly reticent in having a need. They felt they didn't have a need. There's too much of a struggle out there in the world. So for me, and they will have their own views as to whether they are best in class. All I can say is I'm enjoying very much the appetite and the energy of the border force as part of Home Office to normalise the experience of disability as a precursor to help people.
Thanks so much, Kate. Yasmin, we started with you. I just have to say we might have to say goodbye to Susan in one sec. She's got to jump off in a moment. Thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you.
We'll be wrapping up in a couple of minutes, but I know you need to go straight away. Thank you so much. Yasmin, we started with you. I want to give you the final say on kind of where best practice might lie at the moment.
Well, I can give you the good news and the bad news. So the bad news is I don't think anybody's really exemplary. The good news is lots of people are thinking about it and trying to do better. And what I'm learning is the risk is it gets attached to an individual in an organization. And if that individual leaves, things might fall apart. So the big challenge is how do you actually embed this in your systems and processes? And you do that in a couple of ways. And this is what we're doing. We're embedding it in our policies, our procurement policies, our HR policies, our IT policies. We're requiring accessibility. And when it comes to workplace accommodations, which is how we call it in Canada, we're measuring. It's critical. You have to measure. It has to be built into how you measure. So how long does it take? We didn't even know 2 years ago how to measure, but our statistical agency has actually modeled it, and they now know how we can measure it. And once you do that in one organization, you can spread it throughout the enterprise. So it takes policies, it takes leadership commitment, it takes measurement, and it takes a relentless commitment to getting it done. And we still have a long way to go, but I'm very optimistic that we'll get there.
Well, that's a great note to end on. And I see on that point of measurement, we did have a question we weren't able to get to about the importance of measurement and the importance of sharing those statistics and data across the sector as well. It just leaves me to say, unfortunately, as we are out of time, thank you so much to our wonderful panel today, to Susan, to Catherine, to Yasmin, to Kate, to Christina. Thank you so much for sharing all your time and your expertise with us. As you've all said, there's a lot more to do. We will be continuing these conversations here on Global Government Forum. If you or any of your colleagues who are watching are interested, we have another webinar next week on the 5th of May, which will be all about adapting for individuals, so creating an inclusive workforce in the era of hybrid working. We didn't really get into kind of the pandemic and how that's changed things today. So we're having a whole nother conversation about that next week. If you want to join that, the details are there. We'll also make sure that they are emailed to all of you who registered for today's website. We will also be sending a link to today's video so you can watch it all over again or share it with colleagues. And we will be circulating an article in a couple of weeks' time with the key points from today's conversation. But wherever you are in the world today, enjoy the rest of the day. A huge thank you in particular to Catherine for staying up so late in Australia for this conversation. Enjoy your lie-in tomorrow and have a really good day, everybody. And we hope to see you on another one of our webinars very, very soon. Thanks and goodbye, everybody. Goodbye.